All right. So thanks everyone for joining. This is Karen Whitaker from the League of American Bicyclists. And I'm going to talk about the American Jobs Act, the American Jobs Plan and transportation reauthorization, how they may work together and what's possible for bicycling. So I'm going to start by talking about what's in the broad plan and then go to transportation and then go through some analysis. So this is a slide showing sort of what's in it. It's been called an infrastructure plan, and you may have heard there's been some pushback about it. When we think about infrastructure, in general, we focus on things in the far right-hand corner: transportation, drinking and wastewater, broadband, power electric grid. And then I put in this column, resiliency for that infrastructure. And that's the kind of thing that there seems to be some broad agreement on. There's other physical buildings, capital in here, including affordable housing, public schools, childcare facilities, VA hospitals, federal buildings. And then finally, there's what the Biden administration is calling people infrastructure. So research and development, manufacturing, and then workforce development. And so when you're hearing criticism from folks saying it's not infrastructure, it's because they're mostly just want to look at what's in the far left-hand column. This is how the White House has put it out, which is really interesting to me because they combine sort of the home community care, but they didn't combine transportation. If you combined all the transportation pieces, that would be at the top of the list. And I don't know if that's because they think that the home community care is more popular, or because they know that infrastructure, that transportation infrastructure is popular, and by keeping it smaller, maybe it makes all those pieces even more sellable. So, and just quickly on the funding or the pay for, and the pay fors, the way it's written, the American Jobs Plan will cost $2.3 trillion over 8 years. But it's my understanding from talking to folks in the administration, they really see the transportation part as playing out over 5 years, basically the same amount of time that a reauthorization takes. Then in terms of pay-fors, the pay-fors that funding would come in over 15 to 16 years. So the money would go out in 8 years, would be paid back in 15 to 16 years. I'm not going to talk too much about this, other than to say it's controversial, because other than the corporate tax rate, which I know a little bit about, the rest of it I don't really know. So when we look at the transportation funds, here's a quick breakdown. When we talk about roads and bridges, and this is the way the plan is written, it talks about highways, roads, bridges, and main streets. And adding that main streets is really interesting because that's sort of getting into more rural areas, more local roads. So that's $115 billion over 5 years, transit 85 billion, rail 80 billion. It's probably the first time we've seen a proposal come out on transportation that is more for public transportation than it is for the roads and bridges. Electric vehicles is at 160 billion. I know there's been other numbers out there, but the most recent thing I've seen from the administration has it at 160 billion. They've promised a certain number of charging stations, but a lot of this could also go to incentives for people to get EVs. Aviation, ports. The other things that are of interest for us, being interested in biking and walking, is reconnecting communities, which is sort of a highway teardown program. It's an equity program where if a highway, one of the things we saw in the 50s and 60s, if you think about Robert Moses, was building highways through low-income communities, communities of color, dividing them by a highway, exposing all those kids and families to leaded gas. This is a program to undo that and then to help build those communities back later. For road safety, there's 20 billion in road safety, which is a pretty significant investment. We don't usually see safety come up in a stimulus plan like this. And then transformative projects, which I'm not sure how much of that will affect biking and walking, but I think there's an opportunity for us in that pot. So talking about that $115 billion for highways, roads, and bridges. And I will say the Biden administration sees this as additive to reauthorization, not instead of or including reauthorization. So this would be money on top with the idea of going back and fixing what we have, fixing backlogs, things like that. So for the highways, roads, and bridges portion, it talks about repairing and modernizing roads and highways. And one of the things that the administration is trying to do in this package too, which is kind of fallen by the wayside, but I think it's a good effort, is to not just talk about the dollar amount, but to try to specify what that would buy us. So modernizing 20,000 miles of roads and highways, fixing the 10 most economically important, that says buses, it should say bridges, sorry, 10 most economically important bridges, plus doing another 10,000 bridges. So when we see that economically important bridges, that gets to the Gateway project and that between New York and New Jersey, which we know is important. I believe one of these bridges is connected to Kentucky, which is sort of some outreach to Leader McConnell. But those 10,000 bridges, that gets to some of those more rural areas. So I think they're hoping that everyone can see their district in this, everyone can see their area in that. What was most important to me in that description was that they talked not just about fixing it first. And when we say fix it first, we talked about do maintenance before you build new capacity, like bring everything, fix your roads now, but they talked about fixing it right. And they specifically called out for safety, resiliency, and all users. And in talking with the administration about that, they are really thinking about people biking and walking. How do we, it's very much like a complete streets policy moving forward. If as you fix your roads, make sure you do it to work for everyone. And so that was great. Some new information that's come out is looking at how that 115 would break down. So this is what we're hearing now. We're talking about 50 billion for fix it right road modernization. So as you're rebuilding roads, making them more resilient, making them complete streets. The bridge investment program at 40 billion, community transportation block grant at 5 billion. I'm not sure what that is, but looking forward to seeing it. 5 billion for transportation alternatives, which of course we're really excited to see. We still have some ideas and we're still talking with the administration about what a fix it right could mean for biking and walking and possible grant programs out of that. But we're always happy to see that transportation alternatives because that money gets to every state and it gives every community an opportunity to apply for. And then 5 billion for CMAQ, which is congestion mitigation and air quality. And then that 10 billion for a carbon reduction bonus program. One of the things that we saw in the Obama administration that I think this is applying to is a real interest in reward programs. If you remember the Race to the Top program that the Obama administration had for education. So schools that saw their test scores go up, met whatever those criteria were then eligible to apply and get extra funds to do something that was their priority. And so when I see this listed as a bonus program, having seen no description of it, That's what I think it is. And it's very similar to what we saw in the House bill last year, HR 2, where states who reduced their GHG pollution the most got an incentive that they could use 100% federal funding for a certain number of projects. And then those that didn't do it, there was a penalty for. So that idea of bonus and incentive, I think we'll see throughout this. And is also a lot easier to do in a package like this than it is in a reauthorization. Then on safety, we saw that 20 billion for roadway safety. Again, it's pretty unusual to see stimulus funding like this focused on safety. You'll often see safety as one of the uses, but not a primary use for a big pot of money. Within that roadway safety, there's a subset, which they're calling safety for all users or safety for all, that specifically calls out, they say cyclists and pedestrians. And it specifically says it's funding for local plans, both Vision Zero and other safety plans. And I think that is really important because that gets to that local control. For those of you who were at the summit and have been listening to me talk about needing to get safety dollars down to the local level to change how states do things, they heard that. Because lots of times when we see states focus their safety dollars, they are very much focused on the roads in between communities and not the roads within communities. But calling out local plans means this funding is going to get to local communities, or at least that's the goal. And that's how that 20 billion would break down. Half of it would go through the Highway Safety Improvement Plan. There's 1 billion to support safe driving behavior, and that's something that looks like it's not infrastructure, it's more of some of the NHTSA programs, and so we'll be talking with them about that and inequity concerns. That Safe Streets for All fund is 8 billion, which right now we're seeing roughly 1% to 2% of safety dollars going to biking and walking. This would be 40%. That would be a huge increase. And if you put that with the transportation alternatives, now we're talking 13 billion for mostly biking and walking. That last billion is pipelines, hazardous material. But I also just want to, when we're talking about this project versus reauthorization, remember all that money that goes into highway safety, right now, very little of that is spent on biking and walking improvements. But if we were to get some of our reauthorization asks into a bill that then affects the program, then we would see more of that focused on bicyclists and pedestrians. So then when we talk about the reconnecting communities portion of money, it's 25 billion to redress historic inequities and build on the future of transportation infrastructure. So again, we talked about those highways that were built in between communities. That's one of those things they want to go back and fix. Right now, there's a project in Texas where the Texas DOT wants to expand the road, build more capacity, add more lanes. But to do that, it would mostly affect Black and brown communities. It would take out a number of homes, churches, businesses, those kinds of things. And right now the US DOT has put a halt on it, and it's becoming very controversial. This is a tweet from Senator Cornyn saying, hey, the state should be able to do this. So within the plan, 20 billion would go for that idea of tearing down highways and reconnecting communities. There's another 5 billion in there to help low-income communities of color, they say, to thrive. So there's not a lot of specifics on that, but I think that that's really important to think about how do we then reconnect their transportation networks in a way that's going to work for the community? One of the things that's been talked about with this provision is that we also need to look at how this is going to overplay with that affordable community. Are we going to, make all these communities bikeable and walkable only then to have gentrification happen and the folks that are living there now not be able to benefit? So I think there's some thought on that. There's not a lot written down about how that would play out. There we go. And then there's this, this is 25 billion. It's actually 44 billion now when you add a bunch of things to it. But this idea of accelerating transformative investments. So part of it is taking these really big ideas and just getting them ready. So going from, the planning and design into construction and then getting them done. For folks who were around in 2009, when we had the stimulus projects then, that transportation money went out under shovel ready. It was really about creating jobs, getting the economy moving. And the administration said, we want projects that are ready to go, that are ready to be built. Looking back on that, a lot of the folks from the Obama administration say, hey, maybe these weren't the most important projects that we built. And so this is the Biden administration saying, some of these projects aren't going to get built right away, but we're going to make sure that these really important projects start, that they're getting through those pre-steps, the design and planning. Also talked about ambitious projects that have tangible benefits to the region or national economy. So that's what we now think of now as programs of national and regional significance. Generally, those are much bigger than biking and walking projects. And then they also said things that are too big or too complex for existing programs. And that can mean projects that cross state boundaries or even cross MPO boundaries. So that looks like this. I put that lightning bolt in the middle just because I'm not showing the whole chart there, because only that large line of 25 billion is that big. All the other things are 5 billion or less, but I wanted to blow up the chart. So again, you can see at the beginning, not only are there those projects, but there's 5 billion to do research and development. There's including things like what's the best pavement to withstand natural disasters, or what's, there's been a lot of reporting that concrete releases a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Is there something we can do to that, another substance, things like that. That pre-development and planning, which we talked about. Again, another challenge grant program. One we're familiar with, Build, used to be Tiger. That's a program biking and walking has done really well in, both under Obama and under Trump. 5 billion for that. We usually see 500 million from Congress on that. So this is at least a doubling. And then we'd see if Congress adds anything in reauthorization. Infra, which is projects are mostly freight. RIF is for rails. And then these last couple things, private activity bonds, these are just some like public-private partnerships, other creative financing ways. And then this idea of implementation and capacity building, which is part of that workforce development. How do we get, how do we make sure that people have the knowledge and skills to do these jobs, but also to do them with resiliency in mind? So those are the major programs that I think would help biking and walking. I'm going to go through a few more slides and then I'll ask for some questions. So what are the big questions that are remaining? One, of course, is that funding question. A lot of the stakeholders for transportation are private sector businesses, so they're not, they're in the middle of this. They may not like all of the pay-fors, but they do want to see infrastructure. Another is this idea of moving away from a user fee. By having the gas tax pay for the majority of transportation, it does two things. It's that user pay, user benefits. which has been a little bit challenging on the biking and walking side, but overall is seen as something that people understand and are supportive of. The other thing it did is because all those funds were coming from the gas tax and going into the highway trust fund, it allows Congress to write a 5-year bill and plan out that way. For, if you're doing education or environmental work or even foreign aid, foreign policy, the government is deciding how much to fund year to year to year. So a program can start and then stop the next year, restart, stop. So one of the things by having that highway trust fund, by having it be a user fee, that has allowed Congress to have that bank account for transportation that it can write a 5-year plan. And so there's some real concern that if we get away from the user fee on this, is this gonna allow for the reauthorization and other funding to move away from it? So that's one piece of it. The other, so there is some concern on that. The other side I've heard, and I've heard from some members of Congress, is like, yeah, let's keep a user fee for reauthorization. Let's keep that moving forward, whether it's a gas tax or a vehicle miles traveled tax or whatever, or a tax on oil or something like that. But for this, our backlog is so big, whether it's our backlog for public transit, our backlog for roads, for rail, all of these things. For this, we need to just bite the bullet and spend the money and just get us up to snuff, and then we could continue with that user fee moving forward. Another big question is whether this is going to go out through formula funds or discretionary grants. So formula funds, the state gets a chunk of money and then they follow the rules and they spend the money how they want. And they have some leeway in those rules. So for instance, highway safety, where they have a lot of leeway, they're not spending that money on biking and walking. But what it does for that state is they know they have certainty. So they can plan, again, a 5-year project and know we're going to get X number of dollars each year to do this. So for state DOTs and traditional stakeholders, they like that. They like having that certainty. They like relying on the state expertise. Discretionary grants means the decisions are going to be made at the US Department of Transportation. And we know that biking and walking has done really well under that. We've done well under the Tiger program. It would be the people who wrote this plan that would then be making the decisions. And that sounds pretty good to me, looking at how they've written this plan. The White House has been asked about this and they've changed course. So the first day they were asked, Jen Psaki said, oh, it's going to go out through discretionary grants. There was a lot of pushback on that. The second day she said, oh, it's going to go out through a mix of formula funds and discretionary grants. And I think that's okay too. Like, I think when, like we saw transportation alternatives in there, that if that happens, that funding would likely go out through the formula funds. But if we're going to do a program to build out biking and walking networks, that might be a discretionary grant. Another question that I have not heard an answer to yet is, will there be a local match required? Like, if this is true stimulus funds, do we just want to give the money 100%, let's get these projects built, let's create those jobs, or are we still going to create that 20% local match? That's unclear. And then finally, how is it going to affect reauthorization? And this is another place that the White House may be changing course. So up until today, I've been hearing that when the White House puts out its budget tomorrow, it was going to do flat funding for the reauthorization. So the idea being like, we'll just keep things as they are on reauthorization, and then all the new money will come through this project. That did not go over well on Capitol Hill and the folks in charge of writing those bills. And as of today, the White House is saying, no, this is one of our priorities. We want an increase in reauthorization and we want our package. So one change, maybe not as good for us, but the reauthorization change I think is really good. I think it's good for everybody. Just quickly looking at public support. It doesn't have 50% support as of April 2nd, but it is above water. It's got more support than it does people opposing it. But there's a huge amount of people who don't know. And that's why we're seeing Granholm, Walsh, Buttigieg, Harris, just there's a team of people on this from the Capitol that are out there talking about it. And we're going to see that probably through the summer, really trying to push that. Early support shows that the infrastructure that we cared about, that was first, that the Republicans are saying is appropriate, that repair and replacement, that has been really popular. But also this piece of the home-based care for elderly and disabled, also significantly supported. And I think that may be why the Biden administration is including it as a top number, and something that really makes sense to people hopefully coming out of this pandemic. And then you see that idea of paying for it with corporate taxes, very high with Democrats, less than 50% for Republicans. Let me see. And then finally, I just want to talk about what this is versus what it isn't. This is a plan. It's an idea. There's a lot of smart people who had input into it, and I think they probably even have a lot more details on how they want it. But it's just a plan right now. It's about improving the existing infrastructure, trying to set some standards for what a people-centric infrastructure plan could look like moving forward. So let's meet that backlog, and let's talk about how we want to see things moving forward from the Biden perspective. And then also, as the president has talked about, let's do some prep work to keep us competitive, to get us prepared for the next step. And that's a lot of that research and development, the workforce development, that kind of thing. What this isn't, it isn't a bill. It's not legislative language. We don't know the details. The details are not up to the Biden administration. It's up to Congress. This is not reauthorization. And because it's, if it's not reauthorization, if it ends up going through reconciliation, if it ends up not, being bipartisan, then it won't have policy changes. It might have some temporary policy changes on this new money, but those won't be long-term. They're not developed programs, but it's also not all or nothing. Biden has put out his vision, and he of course wants all of it. He doesn't have agreement for all of that on Congress, but he'll push for that. We'll see what we get. And again, right now, it is not bipartisan. So let me. And then, okay, one more slide and then I'll stop. I think, we saw that COVID bill happen so quickly. And so Biden got his first priority through quickly, basically what he wanted. He put out the broad strokes, he got those. This is going to be different. It's going to be different for a couple of reasons. One, on that COVID piece, he had a deadline. Everyone had a deadline. The Democrats had a deadline. They wanted to get it out before unemployment ran out. And so they had to get it out by mid-March. And because they had to get it out in mid-March, everyone understood that. And while there was some back and forth on some things, they pretty much pushed it forward as it was envisioned. They also had the CARE bill already done. And so they just used that structure. They don't have a structure for what they're talking about. I mean, they could use reauthorization, but they don't, the existing bill doesn't have that fix it right policy in it. It doesn't, so, in the transit funding, there's $5 billion there to make transit stations ADA compliant. Like, they'd have to write that. There's not a structure for them to do that now. So those things are going to take longer. We also see it's not, for the Democrats and for the leaders, they have different priorities. And so where with COVID, they were all pretty much on board with the broad strokes, they're not all on board with the broad strokes right now. So for instance, there's a lot of jockeying. We hear about Senator Manchin a lot, but also Senator Warner from Virginia is like not 100% sure on the pay-fors. And so there's going to have to be that workaround. There's a lot of moderates in the House that want a tax change for state and local taxes. That is a really regressive tax. It helps wealthy people a lot more than it helps low-income people. So that's not something that all the Democrats are going to be on board for. So that's something else they're going to have to work out. Progressives are saying, hey, this is a good start, but it's not enough. We want this to be even bigger. So Democrats are all over the board on a number, and that's just talking about funding. That's not even talking about what's in it. The Republican messaging we've seen so far, they're saying it's not honest. This is not just infrastructure. We've talked about wanting infrastructure, but we don't want all of this stuff. They said it's too big, and they're not okay with the funding mechanism. And you have to think, like, the Senator Wicker from Mississippi, who's our lead on transportation alternatives, he was on one of the morning shows, I guess, and said, like, how do you expect this to be bipartisan when it's paid for by taking away our biggest accomplishment, or one of our biggest accomplishments over the last 4 years? He said it would be like the Republicans having proposed something in the Trump administration that was paid for by ending Obamacare. Now, very different policies. The specifics of that I know may not work, but the feeling of taking away something that you've worked really hard on is the same. And so that's like, there's a lot that has to be worked on. So there's some real concerns about how this is going to affect reauthorization. And so with that, let me see if I can do this. I am gonna, oh, here we go. I'll stop and let's see if I see there's some questions in the chat. I got that question about 160 billion for electric vehicles. Are e-bikes and scooters included in that? So right now, they were not envisioned as part of that. I have started that discussion with DOT. I also think there's some interest in the Hill on trying to get those included. I believe it's about 100 billion that would go for incentives for electric vehicles. So it seems like even a little bit could help with that. A question, will the league create a package of asks for bicycle advocates to use in contacting our US reps and senators regarding infrastructure? So I'll say we are really focused right now. The things we want in this bill, in what would be a package, are basically the same things we want in reauthorization. So we're focused on that. We will probably have something on this. We're still, at this point, I'm still talking with the administration as they're fleshing out what they're asking. But yeah, eventually we will get to Congress and we'll have something for that. We'll do action alerts. Right now, we have an action alert out on complete streets because we think that flows very nicely with that idea of fixing it right. All right. So another question on the electric vehicle, electrification can have coattails that can include stores, groceries to provide outlets for e-bikes. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of the funding is to do e-bike charge, or excuse me, electric vehicle charging. So that they've planned for, and that money has been budgeted based on the cost. We can talk to them about it. I think it would be a big win if we could get just some of those tax rebates. And or the other thing I've been talking to them about is if we get a rebate through Congress, is there some way to do a voucher program for low income folks so that they can get that savings up front? Thanks. So Lauren has just put in the link to the Complete Streets action. Thanks, Lauren. So yeah, we will send out the recording of this. So will there be guidance in the bill so DOTs can't flex funds on how they want to spend dollars, i.e. road and bridges versus bike ped projects? So that's a good question. And part of that depends on how the bill happens. So if it happens under reconciliation, it's going to be a lot harder to change policy. So if they put the transportation alternatives money through transportation alternatives, it's not clear to me that they can change any of the policies in there, which would mean that states could still flex 50%. But those are some of the rules that have to go to the parliamentarian, and something I'm still learning about. Yeah, the slides will be available. Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to go back and talk about the reauthorization a bit. So, and I'm mostly just going to talk through this, but one of the big questions is what will be the effect on transportation reauthorization? Like, is this going to open up doors to a bipartisan negotiation, or is it going to slam them shut? And I think there's some hope on the Democratic side that this creates a situation for Republicans where it's like, hey, you can either work with us on a reauthorization, and then you can take credit for infrastructure money and you can get some of your priorities in there, and we'll move that reauthorization forward, or we're just going to do everything reconciliation, and if you're not on board, you're not on board. There's some thoughts on that, and there's some movement towards that. The other thing is that going back to that idea, that I was talking about Senator Wicker saying, like, you're taking away the thing that's most important to us. How can we support this? And so that's, I've been talking to people on the Hill since this came out, mostly focused on reauthorization. And there's no, what we do know is that Chairman DeFazio and CARPER are moving forward. They really want to do reauthorization. The White House is saying this should be in addition to, and they still want to have reauthorization. But it's really unclear how to move forward on this. And to give you an example, I want to just take a minute and talk about Representative Sam Graves of Kansas City, Missouri. So when the Biden proposal first came out, he put out a release that said things like, this is why Congress writes the bill, not the administration, and was pretty negative about it. And then a few hours later, he put out a different statement that says this: our country desperately needs Congress to find common ground to make smart, responsible investments in our infrastructure. Fortunately, this is just the beginning of the process, and as Congress develops infrastructure legislation in the coming weeks, I hope the focus will be on proposals that can, in fact, gain bipartisan support. So it's sort of interesting. You saw sort of that first reaction of, we do not like this, to the second reaction of, we're going to work with our folks on the Hill that we know and come up with what I think Republicans are seeing as an alternative to the infrastructure package. When we talk about the chairs in both the House and the Senate, they are both completely invested in doing their bill this Congress. They want those policy changes. They do. It's not that they don't want the funding that's in the Biden plan, but it's rare that Democrats control both houses. This is an opportunity for them to really push on climate and on safety and change the base policies on how DOTs do their work. And they do not want that opportunity to slip by, and they're not going to be pushed out of the way by this package. They want both, but they want to do their bills. So, and now this is interesting. Both of them are really thinking about a bipartisan bill. This is a little bit of a change for the House. Remember, the House did a really progressive bill last year that was not bipartisan, had new performance measures on climate change and on accessibility and connectivity, significant new funding for biking and walking, a lot more of that sort of incentive-based things, which I said, are really hard to do, but they were able to do it in a partisan fashion. And so with this now sort of emphasis or discussion on things being bipartisan, and there's going to be earmarks, so that's going to help with that. But DeFazio is now talking about, are there some compromises he can make to get this bipartisan so we can have a bipartisan reauthorization and make sure we get that through. Now, part of it is it would also give Biden and the Democrats a win by saying, hey, we can do things bipartisan. The other thing is that the Democrats right now only have a 2-vote majority in the House. I think yesterday, Member Hastings of Florida passed away. So they had a 3-vote majority. Now they have a 2-vote majority. Every time there's an empty seat in the House, those have to go back for election. It's not something that the governor can appoint someone. And so, it is really close. They literally have to keep every Democrat with them and have every Democrat there voting. Like, you can't have someone off sick or in the hospital or whatever. So it is really tight, and making it bipartisan also will help him get a reauthorization and a final bill done. Their timeline, both of them, they're talking about May, possibly June. That's pretty quick. The goal is to have all the other committees do the finance part, do all of that by the end of September. Pelosi has said she wants to get the president's stimulus bill out of the House by Labor Day. So they're on very similar deadlines. I can't imagine both will get done on that deadline, but that's part of it. One of the other things that both DeFazio and CARPER care about, they care about it being paid for. CARPER especially really likes the user fee idea. So they are talking through that. DeFazio has had a number of proposals in the past. Unfortunately, neither of them lead a committee that has to make that decision. So they're coming up with the policy, and then behind the scenes are really working with their cohorts on Ways and Means for DeFazio and on the Senate Finance Committee for CARPER. So it is a way that we could see a major bipartisan piece of legislation, although it will not be, probably the House will not be as progressive as it was last year, but I do think the Senate bill will be more progressive. So maybe in the end, the compromise is just as good. And one of the effects on content that this bill will have, that the president's proposal does, is it gives cover to DeFazio and CARPER. So this idea of a highway teardown program, I think there was a pilot project in the Senate to do something similar last year. It wasn't very big. It might have only been 20 million. Senator Cardin Senator Cardin and Van Hollen from Maryland were leading on that. And then Senator Schumer took it up. And so like that is something that came from Congress. The White House picked it up, and now the House is feeling pressure to include theirs. That's great for us. I mean, I think it's a great program. I think it'll be good for biking and walking because they're measuring connectivity by biking and walking. But that's the kind of thing we're seeing. The White House is going so far, like this idea of a complete streets policy on everything you do. We saw that in the House. Now we're trying to get it in the Senate. There's a complete streets bill in our action alert that's trying to push for funding to do those kinds of projects, very similar to what we're seeing in the president's agenda. So maybe we get a start of that here. So I think it does give that freedom, the idea of maybe right now, there's this general rule in transportation that an agreement that 80% of the funding goes to roads and bridges and 20% goes to transit. There's some talk about push back and forth on that. Maybe more is going to go to transit. That is something we saw in the president's proposal. That gives cover for DeFazio and CARPER to talk through that. So that's one of the effects on that. Okay, so I just want to switch for a second and just focus in on reauthorization, knowing that that's out there, knowing that there's pressure on that. There's still some deadlines coming up in Congress right now that I would love your help addressing. And the first is that April 14th is Member Day. This is the opportunity for members who are not on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to testify and say what's important to them in the next reauthorization. And I'm sure they'll talk about what's important to them in an infrastructure package. This is a good time if you were at the summit, if you weren't at the summit, if you know the staffer, to call them up and ask them, hey, what priorities are you putting in your testimony or in your memo to Transportation and to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee? Are they going to include transportation alternatives? Are they going to include biking and walking safety? Will you please include these? And ask those questions. If they sound positive, even if they sound vaguely positive, you can always ask, hey, are you going to testify in person? And if so, can you give me a time frame? I'd like to watch it. I'd like to share with our members when you're going to be testifying. And so it's an opportunity to again, push our priorities. And anything you push to T&I or CARPER's committee, the Environment and Public Resources, Public Works, these are going to be the same committees working on whatever bill is going to be the president's agenda. So you're pushing the same priorities, which is for us, funding for transportation alternatives and better biking and walking safety. So please, consider that. There's only a week left. They're writing their memos right now. They're probably going to finish them Monday or Tuesday because they got to do it on Wednesday. So talking to them right now and putting that sort of incentive or threat that you might be watching when they testify can help get our stuff into that piece. The other date I want to call out is April 16th for two reasons. One is member designated projects. So April 16th is the day that the members have to put in their projects. They're due to the committee. We know that each office is going to have about $15 to $20 million worth of projects that they can put in as earmarks. So this is like the last few days. If you know they're putting in a biking and walking project, maybe you can get in a letter of recommendation. If if you have an idea for a project, remember the projects either need to be in the state transportation improvement plan or can be eligible for that. Most biking and walking projects are. Really push that on them. It's a little late to put in a new project, but it's at least worth talking to them like, hey, is there anything that you're doing that's going to help biking and walking? I was talking to some members today who said they didn't have any, talking to staffers today, who didn't have any specific biking and walking projects, but they were getting a lot of complete streets projects. So, checking in, saying, these are the things we care about. If you're doing anything like this, let us know. We'd like to help. It's a good opportunity. And I think with that, I'm gonna just end and take questions. So I'm gonna escape from this. Go here. So let me see. So yeah, I got that question of earmarks. There will be earmarks in the transportation reauthorization bill. And there may be some earmarks in the regular budget bill. But again, there was only a 2-week window for members to get them into the committee. So most of them are in there, but it's still worth contacting them and say, hey, there's some great projects in our neighborhood. What are you looking to put forward? Is there anything with biking and walking that we can be supportive of? That'd be helpful. Okay, so a question, explain again why the GOP is not getting in all this. It's not getting all this reauthorization. So let's see. So for reauthorization, last year, the House went forward with a bill that was not bipartisan. And so because of that, like at some point, what happened? Okay, here's what happened. The Senate wrote their bill. It was bipartisan in 2019, but it included a climate title. And when that climate title got to that, when the House saw the Senate bill, the Democrats looked at that climate title and said, hey, that's pretty great. This is coming out of a Republican bill. We as Democrats, we have to do better. And we're going to write an even bigger climate title. The Republicans looked at the climate title that came out of a Republican Senate and said, that is way too much climate. We have to pull back on that. And because the Democrats were so intent on going further and the Republicans were so intent on weakening the climate provisions, the bill never became bipartisan. It's very rare that happens. It did happen in 2012 in the reverse. But because it wasn't bipartisan, the bill didn't get any Republican votes on the floor. That was fine last year because for the Democrats, because the Democrats had, I don't know, a 15-vote majority. So even if they lost a couple people, which they did, it didn't really matter. They had the votes. This year, they would not have the votes for that. So that's where they are in reauthorization. I think in terms of this infrastructure package, Biden said he was willing to work on a bipartisan basis. They don't feel like he is. So part of it is being able to criticize Biden. Part of it is because they say they might be able to get someplace on like transportation infrastructure, but they don't want to do all of this home health care, other stuff. Okay. Oh, Elliot just sent an email saying he thought the earmarks deadline was pushed back to April 23rd. That might be true. Another reason to get in contact with your offices and see if there's anything there that we can do. Oh, yeah. So he just sent me a link on that. So another reason to check in. It still may be a little bit late to offer a new project they haven't thought about, but you can, again, ask them, are you doing anything on biking and walking? Is there a way that we can help you? Maybe there's a complete streets project that if you help them on this time, next time when they're talking about earmarks, they can come back, they'll come back and remember that you helped and ask for your help again. All right. So I think, yeah, so that's all the questions in the chat. If anyone else has questions, you can unmute yourself and just ask. The other thing I'll say is that we are working with some partners about seeing if we can get something into the package, any package, that would do more, be a big chunk of funding to build networks, similar along the lines of the Complete Streets bill, which we talked about at the summit, or the Connecting America's Active Transportation.
Say, Karen, this is Brent Hugh from Missouri. I'm just curious if you know, like, have the Republicans put out their sort of vision for what this would look like, more than you already mentioned about Sam Graves?
So they haven't put out anything in terms of an infrastructure package. Last year, Graves, he's the ranking member on the Transportation Committee, he did put out a substitute bill, which was, it cut back the climate stuff to just resiliency. They can all agree on resiliency, but he wasn't interested in the greenhouse gas emissions pieces. They weren't interested in that. It did include increases to transportation alternatives, though, so they were on board with some improvements there. The biggest complaint the House Republicans had about the transportation last year was the climate, and that it was just overall too big. And that too big funding piece will also apply to this package. So I got a question about, with the increase in biking during COVID, what effect does that have on these efforts? Has it added leverage? I mean, I think it has, in that we're seeing things from the Biden White House and the Buttigieg DOT that that would really work well for us, in terms of, I keep talking about that fixing it right. Like, that is huge to me. That idea of fix it first has been around in progressive transportation for a while, but fixing it first could limit things to who they already serve. Where fixing it right could mean adding sidewalks and separated bike lanes or trails or things like that. So I think that has helped. I would also say that up to this point, I have not heard a lot of pushback on increased funding for biking and walking. We may see it. I have seen it on Fox News. We have seen it in Breitbart, that increasing funding for biking and walking is about helping the 1% and slowing down traffic for everybody else trying to commute. So it may only be a matter of time till we hear that in congressional offices, but we haven't heard it up till now. And we did see in the Republican substitute bill an increase for transportation alternatives. And so, you know, when I'm talking to offices, I am hearing that, oh yeah, we have seen an increase in biking, or yeah, that is important to my district. So I think we have seen that effect. I think we need to be vigilant that these attacks may come about, particularly along biking and bike lanes, that they are for the 1% and they're going to cause congestion. All right, we got 2 minutes left. Any last question? Okay, the thing I'm going to leave you with is that this package is super exciting and it's great for the things we care about, but reauthorization is still incredibly important. So when you look at transportation alternatives, what we see in this package is it would give us an additional $1 billion a year for transportation alternatives, but it wouldn't come with any policy. It would still allow states to transfer 50% of that out. It wouldn't give MPOs the authority to sign contracts and obligate that those funds. And it wouldn't allow any technical assistance for local governments to help them build their projects. And in 5 years, if we don't get reauthorization, or they just continue it for 5 years, transportation alternatives is going to go back to $850 million a year. That's if we got the Biden package with no new reauthorization. If we got reauthorization with no new Biden package, we're looking at an increase of between $350 and $650 million a year. Not 100%, not 1 billion, but more. But we get all those policy changes. We get some limiting language on transferability. We get MPOs, metropolitan areas, being able to sign contracts and get projects moving faster than the state. We get technical assistance for local governments. And in 5 years, we start somewhere, transportation alternatives would start again at 1.3 to 1.5, 1.6 billion a year. So there's good in both, but I think we need reauthorization. We want the stimulus package. But it's 5 o'clock, so please feel free to email me with any other questions. We'll have a blog up on this. We'll have the recording and the slides available. And thanks for joining me.